very much. First, thanks for giving me the opportunity to be back here. And also, I apologize in case of any inconsistency with my English, because it's been a long time without speaking US. So, of course, you start losing, use it or lose it, and I haven't used it that much English. I was thinking in the presentation for today, and what can we show that's kind of different. And I wanted to show a story, things that happened after I finished here my PhD. And that started with my dissertation, but actually started with a post. And it's a journey of going through science in conservation practice and then back to science. So I decided to start with this picture, and could be other, which is a Darwin's fox. At that time, 10 years ago, it was a critically endangered species with only 2 known populations. Oops. Yeah. So, so the general context we're working is, in my case, I work with animals, especially mammals. I used to work with TCD, but I was with mammals. And the typical things we start is the concepts like defaunation and the decline in forest and vertebrate abundance, increasing temperature change, increasing human population. And in my work, I have been working with the causes of defaunation and different type of things, including land use change, human-wildlife conflict, some collaborations. That's work from a colleague that I have collaborated in the effect of artificial light at night, and invasive species, including the diverse study models. My preferred ones are mammals and carnivores, but also small mammals and some invertebrates and people. Of course, when you work with conservation, you think you were talking about biology, and soon you end up working, whether you like it or not, but you end up with people if you work with conservation. And quickly, we ended up doing some human dimensions, and actually, we edited a book on human dimensions in Spanish. There was a material in Spanish, so we edited a book. Marce Marquez is going to be here next week, participated with a chapter here. But my research line and my PhD was about domestic dogs and wildlife. Here is nice, there's no stray dogs. It's been a week without seeing a single stray dog. Usually it's not an hour in Chile. And domestic dogs is a big issue in many countries of the world, not in the developed countries, and actually are listed among the top 3 most damaging vertebrates in the world. This is the issue in Chile. This is a typical street. That's my city, Valdivia. You can, if you want to see that, you can go every day to the river, and you're going to see things like that every day. And of course, wildlife struggle to coexist with dogs. This is actually a few meters away from my office. Dogs are a problem that's linked to people. Unlike we often frame the topic as feral dogs, in general, we're not talking about feral dogs. It's that people have dogs and people love dogs, but they manage them in inadequate ways. So people like dogs, have dogs, but management is poor. People manage dogs for human interest, but when they damage wildlife, there's not much interest about that. And of course, the most likely scenario when dogs damage wildlife is doing nothing. And my dissertation here ended up addressing this kind of problem with a threatened species. The poodle is a small deer, about this size. We often say that's the smallest deer in the world. That's not so true, because there's another poodle that lives in Peru and Colombia and Ecuador that is a little smaller than our poodle. So, and what we found, and we have found consistently, is in other studies that essentially the best predictor for poodle are dogs, even when you account for other stuff like land use change. After all, this deer is a deer, so it can tolerate a lot of habitat disturbance. The They don't have problems with roads. Pumas don't explain distribution. Pumas eat those guys, so are in the same place as those guys. And in there, when we chose a study area, we chose an area where hunting was almost inexistent. Of course, dogs are correlated to people, and people is correlated to everything, but hunting is a big issue that we would not be able to tease out. So we chose an area where hunting is almost inexistent. So this was one of the last frames I used when presenting my dissertation here. We were working with camera traps. After I left, a few months later, we got this picture. And that picture was really exciting because that's a Darwin's fox. And Darwin's fox is a threatened, it was considered critically endangered. It was supposed to have around 215 kilos. And it was a mystery because the fox was in an island, in Chile Island, and 500 kilometers to the north. But we found a population that's in the middle of both of them. I left Florida in May 2012, so that was around a month later. And that was a major discovery for Chile. So it went to the press. Of course, we published that. It was too local, since several journals considered it was too local. So we ended up publishing in a Chilean journal. However, if I had to leave only one of my papers, I would choose this one, although the impact factor is pretty low, because this was important. And what happened here is that the species was located here, and we found a population here. Now we know the species is all around here. This was very important, not only because we found an endangered fox. However, once you discover things, you have to do things about it. And this fox was and is one of the main conservation priorities in Chile. It's a pretty small one. This tube is 30 centimeters, and those foxes can be around 2 kilograms. Those are pretty small. We discovered that population in 2012. We needed to be secure that the foxes were there, so we waited until having more pictures. So we made that public around a year later. But some needs appear. First, we need a monitoring plan. Second, the area where we found the foxes was in time to update their management. That was a really important thing because that's what moved us from pure research to actual conservation practice. And then we found a couple of things. A management plan for a protected area is neither a research project nor a species conservation. The area where we found the fox is owned by the Nature Conservancy, and we applied to lead the management plan for the protected area, the Valdivian Coastal Reserve. And we won that project with a quick and nice discovery, which was we had to do the management plan, conservation plan, and monitoring plan. And that sounded like a new dissertation. For all of you that are doing your dissertation, you know, a new dissertation just after you finish the first one is a whole new world. But it's when I mention this is like a second dissertation, it's because we have to learn everything. First, I made a choice when I was in my last year here. Of course, there's an opportunity to take a new class. So I had two options: conservation planning by Carl Didier and me, and also Bayesian statistics. You know, I chose Bayesian statistics. I never used Bayesian later, but I had to learn conservation. So take the class. So that's one thing, but also is when you are working in planning, you tend to think about these research components and a really nice diagnosis of the problem. And then you have a lot of humans. When I'm saying a lot of humans, I have to think about the work conditions of the park rangers. You need to think about things like cleaning patterns. You need to think in a lot of stuff that's linked to conservation practice. And actually, if you think in a monitoring program that is expected to work, it needs to be run by rangers. Rangers our countries usually are people that really good at their job, they love their jobs, but they don't have an undergrad degree or a graduate degree. So you need to plan ahead of that. They have to do the monitoring, but also attend visitors. They have also to do other things like cleaning bathrooms and things like that. So this is a whole new world in terms of how you plan a protected area and make things work. So we started our work here in terms of process coordination. It was joint work with the Nature Conservancy. And also, conservation planning is not just a technical process, but also includes many participatory components. And that, again, is a whole room to make mistakes. Because we know our own language, but then you have to talk with the communities. You have to talk to stakeholders from other disciplines. For example, cultural stuff. You make mistakes, and we make many mistakes. And we are used to be here. We're after a PhD. No, you don't feel comfortable, but you feel something kind of comfortable around here. But when you need to use the information and integrate, then you move to another field where other stakeholders take important roles. And we're talking about practitioners, policymakers, park rangers in protected areas. Park rangers are the key. If they like the job, things are going to be good. If they are not part of that, forget it. So, and of course, many other local stakeholders like fishermen organizations and livestock owners and the community that lives around the protected area. So we have to move out of our comfortable zone to here. And the planning framework we used was the open standards. The reason we chose that was simple. The Nature Conservancy used that. But also we move into several other stuff because there are things that work in Chile using the logical framework. So we had to move also to that planning framework. And also you look at the open standards and the guidelines, it's pretty short. But there's a lot of more big manuals that you can use to get into this. And I'm not going to go in all the detail, but I'm going to highlight some things. The first step in the planning process is now called assess. It was called conceptualize. And it's essentially focusing on building your equipment, your team, sorry, Spanish is equipo. You have to build your team, you have to propose a visual for the area, choose conservation target, do a threat analysis, do a situation analysis, which is a conceptual model. I'm not showing that here, but also links between conservation targets and the community. We're talking about human well-being targets linked by ecosystem services. But we need to understand the process. And again, many of us tend to work here in how mechanisms 1 and 2 and 3 and 10 affect, by which a threat affect a conservation target. For example, I used to work here. Dogs to Darwin's folks to another species. And we can look at several mechanisms and we can do a whole research program exploring how one threat affects one or several conservation targets. However, when you want to do managing, you actually need to understand the problem. And the problem starts from the threat and you have to go here. And then you move in the human dimensions. That's pretty quick and pretty fast. Because essentially, what you are addressing, for example, if you are talking about dogs, if you think that the problem is taking out the dogs, that's a secure road to fail. Actually, Chile tried to do that, and we ended up with the dogs more protected than before. Because we, as a country, thought, okay, dogs are a problem, let's kill the dog. So you can imagine how people reacted to that. So now you cannot use lethal control with dogs in Chile at all. So you need to understand the problem, and that's part of the diagnosis. Key challenges in this stage is the organization and facilitation of participatory processes. We tend to make the mistake of thinking this kind of stuff as very technical things, and that anyone can do facilitation. That's a big mistake. Facilitation is in itself really complicated. You cannot play the technical part and the facilitation part at the same time. We learned that in not the correct way. Trying to do both, of course, it was problematic. You cannot moderate when you're a stakeholder too. So this is a key part. It's fundamental because you get into conflict when you are planning. Also, finding common language. When you talk with the communities, and we have seen many colleagues that really have problems understanding that if you want to communicate, you need to be understood by people. So if people says for Puma or cougar, if people says leon, lion, don't correct them. It's leon. But many people in academia think that you need to use a highly technical language with community. That's a big mistake. And if we want to end up in a good place, we need to adapt the language. And if we are not able to talk that language, we need someone else to do that. Other key challenge is the integration of multiple sources of knowledge. We tend to think in papers. And first, we're working in local skills. So papers are very useful. However, many things you're not going to find it. For example, if you do a threat analysis involves assessing the scope of a threat, the severity of the threat, and also the reversibility or the time to recovery. Probably severity and time of recovery, you can get that from the literature, either for those pieces or someone else. However, the scope is really context dependent. You need information from the area. And in many cases, there's no information. So you need to rely on other sources of information. If there's monitoring, that's a good scenario. Use that. However, in many cases, you're going to have to use expert opinion. You're going to have to use rangers' opinion, even local community opinion. And that's far from perfect in many cases, but you have to plan with the best evidence available. And that's important because we tend to say we need more information. However, if you expect to pass 5 years, 10 years generating the information for a management plan, you're choosing research over doing something in the area. If the research gap or the knowledge gap are so important that you cannot manage the area or take basic decision, that should be the management plan. Should be part of the first management cycle if it's critical. But as researchers, and I have found that the most complicated workshops are not with the community, are with researchers. As researchers, we tend to think as any of those things as an NSF project. However, we are making other decisions, and we need to think if the information gaps are critical or not. And we have to deal with uncertainty. That's reality, and we cannot escape from it. What can we provide as researchers in these kind of processes? Critical analysis of the evidence. Managers, in many cases, use the evidence. It's in a paper, the thing is correct. It's not their role, by the way, it's our role. So we can provide critical assessment of the information they are using, if it's rigorous enough, or if we may not trust that information. That's something that we can contribute. We can contribute in understanding how the system works based on the best available evidence. We can bring information, useful information from other study systems. That's really important because sometimes people tend to think, okay, that hasn't been done here, but was done in Chile, in Argentina. We can use the information from Argentina. Certainly we can. But the translation of that is a point where we can help. And of course, that's something hard with many colleagues, but if a planning process is going on, the information is needed now. Not once we publish that. The publication process can be pretty quick, but usually it's not. And if you wait for 3 or 4 or 5 years, the management plan is dead. So we have to be willing to provide information that has not yet been published and may have consequences. We suspect that, for example, in the case of the finding of the Darwin's fox, the fact that we made that public before publication compromised publication. However, at that moment they were working in the national plan for the species. So there was an ethical component. Yeah, we keep the novelty for the paper, but let's talk about ethics. So we made it public. So if that affected the paper, it doesn't matter. But that's really complicated. And for some reason, we tend to think that someone's going to steal our data. But first, people in management are not concerned about publishing. Second, the information that's requested is not for complicated analysis. Actually, things they tend to need are where the species, what are the hotspots. So you can provide information. And if there are concerns, you can clean part of the data, and it's fine. You can use it anyway. However, one of the striking things here that happened to us is finding that sometimes our research is not so useful. And the complicated part is when you realize, no, it's really easy when you criticize others. However, when you realize that your own research on the conservation target and the threat cannot be used in the management plan because you didn't report certain things because they were too local, then you realize that maybe the research that could be really useful is not. And it's a hard finding because we tend to think that we are working with an endangered species, and so we are doing applied stuff. And sometimes we're not reporting, and we're not reporting the critical information. So research could be more useful if, for example, we report the basics. Things like naive occupancy. I use occupancy models, and with camera traps, this is something that it's often not reported. Species list. Yeah, we conducted camera trapping, but our study was on one species and one threat or something, and all the other part of the data set is not reported. There's no problem in adding one table, providing the list of species for a place, or supplementary material. But the key point here is that if we want our research to be useful, we also need to know what managers need. And that forces us to know the planning processes, the management plans of the areas where we are working. So that's the only way. I use a few examples here, but I could do many others. For example, with human dimensions, with interviews. There's really a lot of useful information that's not reported. So we need to report the basics. In the case of quantitative studies, this sounds like obvious. Every statistics class state this, but when you look at paper, that's not really the case in many cases. We need to report effect sizes. For example, when you conduct a threat analysis, if we want to move toward rigorous analysis, we need studies that can provide us the odds ratios or other forms of effect sizes. Also, we need to integrate multiple disciplines. We tend to think that if we do interviews, we are doing interdisciplinary. But the point is integration of the disciplines. It's not just doing interviews, and also there's a lot of work that's just interviews conducted by biologists. That's not really good research in terms of human dimensions. But there's also many cases where there's people in human dimension that think that because they are working with people, it's interdisciplinary. No, that's not. Could be good social science or not so good social science, but it's social science. When we are talking about integration, we are talking about integrating the biological and the human components of the problems. And many other disciplines. I'm talking about human dimensions and biological conservation or wildlife conservation. However, there are many other disciplines, could be engineering or other. And the other thing that's really important is that outputs of planning process should be used to identify knowledge gaps. We tend to be kind of self-contained in addressing priorities. So we look at papers, look at priorities based on paper and knowledge gaps. We consider something that's useful. Actually, there's a whole lot of paper suggesting methods to identify key questions, like 100 questions in the name of the paper. And in many cases, not all of them, those exercises are conducted among faculty and grad students, or faculty, grad student, and something else that's also in the same round. But if we need to identify the key knowledge gaps for management purposes, we need to look at the planning purpose, the planning processes. For example, in our case, the information ended up being useful to build conceptual models because, for example, our data provide information which species were, the effects of one of the threats over conservation targets, and also some contributing factors. For example, dogs move through roads. And that's really important because if there are no roads, there are no dogs in dense forest. But also, conceptual models help us to identify hypotheses to be tested. For example, at that point, this link was not tested. We already did, haven't published that yet. However, for example, irresponsible ownership of dogs could be caused by lack of knowledge. But those that work on human dimensions can see an immediate problem here because knowledge is not behavior. So we can identify from conceptual models hypotheses that need to be tested in order to inform decisions. In terms of the planning component, we face again major challenges, and I think that here we face more challenges than in the previous component because at this stage we are not diagnosing a problem, but we are proposing solutions for the problem. And then we move into one of the big problems of conservation science as a discipline, which is that we don't test many management alternatives. And in many cases, the strategies that are proposed have never been tested. And we tend to think that if we diagnose a problem, we have the solution. But think in cancer, in lung cancer. You know that smoking causes cancer, but quitting smoking doesn't cure cancer. So knowing the diagnosis is not knowing the solution. The solution sometimes is different from the cause of the problem. So lack of evidence is a key challenge for planning because we tend to have a lot of information for the diagnosis component, but not so much to plan strategies and to build the theories of change. Then another key component is the logistical and financial constraints. The budgets of protected areas are pretty low, and sometimes we get surprises. We in science tend to complain about our funding. It's low. It's usually low, and in every country we say so. However, I had last year got a fund which is equivalent to an NSF, and I was working with rangers in a protected area in Patagonia. So of course, rangers congratulate me, and we make an asado, of course. And the awkward question came, how much money? And the answer to that question was problematic because I had, for my fundacy, around 5 times the budget they had for 150,000 hectares per year. And that was to address one question. And they had to manage 150,000 hectares with less than $2,000 per year. 2,000? Yeah. No, 10, sorry, 20. So, but it's crazy. The amount of money that they have is crazy. So, we need necessarily to think in the logistic and financial constraints. large areas, lack of money, really complicated conditions. Another problem we tend to have is the difficulties in costing strategies. We are really good at suggesting things, but we don't know how much they cost. And we're working on that. Then the other thing, this is pretty complicated for us. We have to take many decisions in very short time frame. And that's really complicated to us because we work in single questions in many years. And then we're forced to make many decisions. And that's really, it's, I guess, complicated for us. For decision makers, they are used to that. Maybe for us, it's hard to close our eyes to that. More research is needed. It's not a useful answer. As I mentioned, if more research is really needed, then we need to do a strategy to generate that information. And if it's not that critical, then okay, someone will generate that information somewhere inside. And another critical point is that when strategies that we propose affect stakeholders, we need to include stakeholders. This is really important. Again, we can find many dimensions of importance. One is because we want to involve people, we don't want to cause damage, but also strategies that don't consider stakeholders that are going to be affected are going to fail, and that's secure. For example, a classic example in Chile is all the strategies that try to control cattle inside protected areas. All of them fail. Most of them. This one did not fail. But most of them fail because the strategy is cattle in, cattle out. So we forbid cattle and cattle is going to be out. That's not going to happen. The only case we know with experience of success here is this one in the Valdivian Coastal Reserve, but that was related to understanding the problem because people was having their cattle inside the protected area for a few reasons. One was historical, but the other, which is more obvious, is that during winter, their pastures go underwater. And whether you like it or not, cattle is never going to be a manatee. So they are going to move into a forest. And if you don't consider that, you're not going to solve the problem. And in that case, the solution, which has worked in general, it's not perfect, was to provide areas inside the protected areas where they can keep the cattle with conditions. And the objectives in the management plan are not to reduce the number of cows, is instead to reduce the area affected by cows. So instead of what we are aiming is at reducing the area impacted by cows. And where is the cattle? Areas that are highly degraded anyway. So it's been useful. Cattle is maybe 90% of the area is free of cattle, which is a big success. And by the way, the strategy worked so well that dogs went down also, because dogs go into the protected area because they go with cattle. What can we provide? Critical analysis of theory of change, synthesis. And this is an initiative I like it, which is what works in conservation from the group by William Sutherland. They have been conducting synthesis, of course. You need to read the complete account. We tend to read just the first line, it works. No, you need to read the whole thing as they suggest. But this kind of initiative is very useful. At this stage, we can provide advice for the selection of indicators and design of monitoring plans. We're good at that. And we can do that. Also, we can provide advice for spatial prioritization strategies. And our research could be more useful if we help prioritization by providing fair assessment of the magnitude of the threats. That's important because when we publish, everyone sells. And everyone is trying to sell the problem and stating that the problem is the biggest problem and it's going to be the extinction of everything and the apocalypse is pretty close to come. But not all threats are equal. And if we make the point that every threat is really the worst, then what we are telling managers is do whatever, because everything is equally important. That's not true. So that's something that we need to consider. For example, I have been working with dogs. There's a lot of people in Chile stating like almost dogs is going to be the extinction of every species in Chile, and that's not true. Dogs are a problem for a few species and a big problem, but they are not a problem for every species. So, and in fact, I mentioned dogs are a big problem for species like the poodle, that's small deer. However, if there are no roads or if the forest is continuous, there are no dogs. So it's clear that the problem is addressed, is that the habitat issue is more important than the dogs, even though I work with dogs. And for publication purposes, it would be useful to say that dogs are the worst in the world, but habitat is more important. We need to develop indicators that can be measured with realistic budgets. We need to start thinking in testing solutions for conservation problems. And the problem here goes beyond, for example, getting funding for this is more difficult. I think at least in Chile for funds, it would be much more difficult to get funding for this than to elaborate on sophisticated questions on how a given threat affects the genome, the genetic component of a species. That probably is much easier to fund. And also if we test key assumption of theories of change. That's important because sometimes we rely on strategies that are very obvious and may not work. For example, in our case with dogs, the key things that everyone's talk about is neutering, education is the solution for everything, and vaccination. But all the strategies have key assumptions, that is low immigration rates. If immigration rates are high, then if we neuter, it doesn't matter because dogs come from elsewhere. If we vaccinate, doesn't matter because we need coverage, for example, 90% or more of the population. With COVID, everyone is immunized. CDD, and distemper virus, is much more complicated than COVID, so you need a much higher vaccination rate. But if population turnover is high, then in a few months, you don't get adequate protection. So we tested that, and what we found is that most dogs in rural areas come from cities because people bring them. So at this case, if you neuter the dogs, it doesn't work because people bring the dogs somewhere from other place. Abandonment was not the biggest issue, and well, vaccination, you would need to vaccinate almost every dog 2 times a year. That's it. And the implementation is again another step, and there's part of this that's really on the manager side, the implementation, but also monitoring comes back again to us, where we can have a really important input. And what can we do here? Help to evaluate the effectiveness of strategies, of course, according to our own disciplines. That's related to monitoring, but considering the logistical capacities of the place. Capacity building, that's really important, especially in the case of monitoring. Analytical tools. We can help to understand unusual behavior of indicators. Sometimes an indicator can go down. That happened to us with this year. But the problem was that probability of detection went down 1 year. I'm going to explain why. So we had to explain that was that nothing happened with the deer. That was a detectability issue. We can share results through publications, and also very important, and this is something that we need to take care, is that we need to develop protocols for quality control and data standards. Monitoring, whether it's wildlife or human dimensions, also tend to have many flaws, and we can help here. We are doing with SummerRest. To help here, we have some needs, and of course, we need to be able to publish the data. And that's important for managers, but because otherwise we're not going to be able to justify in our works that we are doing this stuff, because you will say you are not a manager, you are a researcher or professor. But also we need that collaboration or these kind of projects need to be recognized by institutions. And that's important in terms of promotion and also in terms of different forms of evaluation. We are training people, we're training future professionals, and sometimes we don't give value to this. And so we are training future professionals in things that we don't know how to do. And that's pretty problematic. But institutions don't tend to recognize this. In our case, in terms of implementation, perfect. I'm gonna we implemented a monitoring program, and that was really interesting because that started with my dissertation. This was funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service. I thank them because they rejected my first project. Rejection can be useful, and one of the reasons they rejected is because we were not really working together with the protector. And things like reading the management plan, we didn't do that, and things like that, so they rejected the project. That's the most important rejection I have had in my life. Thank the Fish and Wildlife for that. We got it the next year. We learned that we tried to introduce camera traps, had a design made here that didn't work. It was really brilliant. We have to learn that monitoring for management purposes is different than research purposes, and that we need to involve park rangers. Then we had a phase, a step in our implementation that was co-designed with rangers. And that was really important because we conducted some pilots to test installation rates, because we needed to design a plan that could be executed in a number of days. Detection rates, that's to be sure that we are going to be able to monitor what we wanted to monitor, and feasibility. And we have been running this monitoring program since 2015, and it's executed by the rangers, by us. We like to go there, but they do it. We have to adjust many things, like the use of baits and lures. We had to respond to unexpected problems, like data losses. A computer was formatted. That was the reason the probability of detection went down. Lockdowns and other problems. And we had to work a lot on this, that data processing and quality control. So this is one case. This were in 2022, but I didn't have the figure here. So what we are seeing, and also we get information from management. For example, this is shaded areas show where the Darwin's foxes are, and the other are the detection of dogs. This is the area where strategies with dogs were being implemented. Why? Because there are many dogs there. The critical area was here, and there was no strategy going on there. And those were 11 houses. It's pretty difficult to access. So monitoring indicated that we had to address that part. That was the critical area, not where we were working. And in terms of research, we have been able to get a lot of products, and a few are under review right now. And it's co-designed, and actually Erwin and Danilo are rangers, and Patricio works in protected area system. So we have been co-designing our work. And we have scaled this up to the country. So we had parallel process that convert. CONAF, the park administrator in Chile, started testing camera traps 10 years ago. We conducted a few capacity building workshops. Many are here, I don't know. But the methodology we co-designed with rangers was adopted by the national park system. That was really important. A pilot monitoring was conducted in 5 protected areas, in addition to the one that we were conducting. And then this was expanded to a whole system. So actually, this is the website of CONAF. And those are all the places that right now are conducting monitoring. Chile didn't have monitoring 10 years ago. So this is a huge advance. And in terms of challenges, quality control, processing and analytical capacities. We need better integration between researchers and managers. Generation of national level indicators, that's something that we need to work. And also recognizing that monitoring is more than camera traps. So we are now working in the application of terrestrial and marine patrolling systematized through SMART. So other countries are using that. We are moving that into Chile. And right now we're working in moving this outside protected areas. Actually, in this case, in terms of urban and peri-urban wildlife, that's a winner. That was recorded in the school of my kids. It's a cat like this. And we also scale up the planning processes. So at this stage, we review the methodology that Chile was using, that was based on the ethical framework. We compared to the open standard. We found that essentially most of the things that were in the management plan were not being included in the operative plans. So essentially 75% of the operative plans didn't came from management plan at national level. So we developed a planning manual, which is based on the open standard, that adapted the open standard to the Chilean Park Administration system. That's the version we developed. Emphasis was on operability and traceability. This is in force since 2015, but was updated in 2017. This is nice because right now this is not Sepúlveda and Silva Esteves, it's the government document. They conducted 4 pilots and then expanded to the whole country. Now this is being implemented in the whole country, and several management plans are finished and many others are coming soon. Those are a few examples. And the Chilean system was also received some awards for this. What are the current challenges we are facing? The planning process is taking too long. The assess component in particular is taking too long. What we are doing to help that, we elaborated some guidelines that include templates on how to write the management plans. Also, we're building, how we call them? Generic conceptual model and generic theories of change. So they can be quickly used and adapted for different protected areas because we need to reduce planning times. We cannot take 3 years in planning a management plan that's going to have a useful life of 5 years. Really good. Participatory processes are often complex. We are concerned because many management plans are becoming too ambitious, so they're not going to get what they would expect. And there are many tools to develop management plans, not so many to evaluate them. Even if you go to the Foundation of Success or conservation measure partnerships, they don't have many tools to evaluate the effectiveness of management plan. We're working on that too, and CONAF is doing that. And just one last thought, which is the challenges and benefits of working in this interface between research and practice. First, at the beginning, it's really difficult to perform well on those different fronts. It's difficult to be thinking in a research project and data analysis, while at the same time thinking in a management plan, because in a management plan, you have to think in so many different things. So it's complicated at the beginning. After a few years, you get used to it. This is that's really complicated, especially when you're starting. That happened to me 3 years after finishing my PhD. Your work may not be much. And that's really important. And I can give my opinion, the year we published that, the manual that's used in Chile, of course, you can imagine my number of publications was 0. And my evaluation of that year was insufficient. And we published the manual that's used for planning the whole country. But it's not a paper. So if I would have done better by publishing a low quality paper, I would have had a better evaluation. And you have to be prepared for it. So this work may not be valid in the short term. In the long term, it will pay and makes a difference. So, but good things are never easy, and this is not easy. What brings to you conservation practice brings reality to your research. It also brings reality to your class. That's something that's really important. When you teach, I imagine that just for us in Chile, even if you are in a research university, that's my case, they think, they say that you have maybe 30–40% teaching, but I teach 5 classes per year. For 40% teaching here is 2 courses per year. We have to teach 4 or 5 and do administration and other stuff. When you have to teach, having connection with reality is really important, and students value that. And it's also useful, I realize that it's really useful for your interviews too, because it's very likely that when you apply for a job, for sure there's going to be someone with better publications than you. That's for sure. I applied to 2 academic jobs, and I got both. And in both cases, there were people with more papers than you. So assume that you need to be, unless you are the publishing crack, and in that case, that's another thing. But there's always someone else that publishes more than you. So you need to be prepared to be different. And this is something that's of course, you need to publish. If you are pursuing an academic career, if you only do applied stuff or this kind of thing, you're not going to get an academic job. You need to publish. But if you want to be different, this is going to be really useful. And another point that's really important, it can open important job opportunities outside of academia. One of my best friends work in the same area. Actually, from my research group, I'm the only one that still is in academia. Her colleagues left academia because they start working in NGOs or the government, even having PhD and good publication track, because career opportunities became more interesting. The possibility of having a greater impact and good jobs is also important. So you can look at that. And also, if you, like me, are working in academia, it can open important opportunities for your students. So one of my last undergrad students got a position at CONAF, working in monitoring and planning recently. So this makes different not only for you, but also for your students. And of course, as professors, I guess that you expect that your students will be better than you. I guess that's very basic for a good professor. And maybe the most important performance indicator is not you, it's how people you train. So that's something really important to consider. So this all happened because of these folks. And of course, although they are not here, I would like to thank my lab. We have a great lab, several grad students, but also some professionals working with us, make all this possible because we're in several fronts at the same time. And of course, the main 2 projects we have right now, which is one by Fondesit and Programa Austral Patagonia in Chile.